What if the person who offered you a ride became your worst nightmare? September 19th, 1992. Two joggers veer off their usual path in Belanglo State Forest, south of Sydney. Beneath a scattered pile of branches and leaves, they find something that stops them cold. A human skeleton, partially buried, hidden with deliberate care. Within months, more bodies surface. 7 young backpackers, British, German, Australian. Each one last seen hitchhiking along the same stretch of highway. Stab wounds, gunshot wounds, signs of restraint. The forest had kept their secrets for years, and the man who buried them there, he'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time. But before the bodies were found, before the world knew his name, it all began with young travelers chasing freedom on Australia's endless roads, and the quiet moment that they made a choice that would cost them everything. The forest wasn't supposed to give them back. September 19th, 1992. Two orienteering runners training in Belanglo State Forest veer off trail near Executioner's Drop. Beneath a deliberate pile of branches and debris, they find skeletal remains, partially buried, concealed with disturbing care. Police arrive within hours. As they carefully excavate the site, they discover a second body nearby. The victims are identified as British backpackers Caroline Clark, 21, and Joanne Walters, 22, two friends who disappeared 6 months earlier while hitchhiking from Sydney. The bodies show clear signs of brutal violence, stab wounds so deep they severed bone, evidence of restraint, deliberate concealment. But this was only the beginning. The investigation stalls for over a year. Detectives comb through missing persons reports, follow dead-end leads, search surrounding areas. The forest keeps its silence. Then, in October 1993, a man searching for firewood stumbles upon more human remains. Police swarm the forest again, this time with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Over the next few weeks, 5 more bodies are discovered, all buried in shallow graves within the same section of forest. The victims, Australian teenagers Deborah Everest, 19, and James Gibson, 19, who vanished in 1989. German backpacker Simone Schmidl, 21, missing since January 1991, and German couple Gabor Negabor, 21, and Anja Habshid, 20, last seen on New Year's Day, 1992. 7 bodies, 5 international travelers and 2 Australians, all young, all found within a concentrated area, all showing signs of methodical brutality, stab wounds, gunshot wounds, evidence of torture and restraint. Every victim was found hidden within Executioner's Drop, a network of remote fire trails deep in the forest, far from main roads, where screams will dissolve into silence. The pattern was undeniable. These weren't random acts of violence. These weren't accidents or crimes of passion. Someone had been using this forest as a hunting ground, luring victims into the trees, killing them in cold precision, and burying them where no one would ever look. The investigation shifted from recovery to something far more urgent, a manhunt. Because whoever did this was going on undetected for at least 4 years. And the most terrifying question facing detectives was this: how did he choose them? How did he get them into the forest? And how many times had he done this before? The answer would come from understanding his method and the types of victims he targeted. Didn't hunt randomly, he hunted smart. As the detectives analyzed the crime scenes, a chilling pattern emerged. Every victim had been hitchhiking, moving along the highways between Sydney and Melbourne, thumbs out, trusting strangers for rides. Investigators suspected the killer picked up his victims as they hitchhiked through Australia. Young, far from home, often traveling alone or in pairs. Backpackers who told hostel friends they were heading south or catching a lift to the coast. Vague plans that left no trail, no witnesses, no one to notice when they never arrived. The victims came from Britain, Germany, and Australia. Different languages, different backgrounds, but all sharing one fatal vulnerability. They were transient. If a German backpacker vanished between Sydney and Melbourne, it might be days, sometimes weeks, before anyone realized they were missing. By then, any trail had gone cold. The forest wasn't chosen by accident. It was deliberate. A hunting ground he knew intimately. The hidden trails, the secluded spots far from walking paths, the places where shallow graves would remain undiscovered for years. And what happened in those trees was methodical. Victims were restrained, tortured, killed with precision. Stab wounds, gunshots, attacks from behind. These weren't crimes of passion or sudden rage. They were calculated, controlled, sadistic. The timeline told a darker story. The first victims disappeared in 1989, the last in 1993. 4 years, 7 confirmed victims. But how many rides had he offered during that time? How many backpackers had he approached on those highways? How many did he let go? How many were still left undiscovered? The killer wasn't just violent. He was patient, methodical, and disciplined. He'd been doing this for years, perfecting his method, selecting his victims, operating in plain sight along one of Australia's busiest travel corridors. He looked ordinary, sounded helpful, and by the time his victims realized their mistake, they were already miles into the forest. The question consuming investigators was no longer what happened in Belanglo Forest. It was who. Who had this kind of knowledge of the forest? Who had the opportunity to hunt along these highways undetected? Who was confident enough, skilled enough, and sadistic enough to do this over and over again? The answer would come from an unexpected source, not from the dead, but from the one lucky victim who managed to escape alive. The monster had a name, and he'd been hiding in plain sight. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on December 27, 1944, the fifth of 14 children in a chaotic Croatian immigrant household in Guildford, Australia. Violence was woven into the fabric of his upbringing. His father's fists served as discipline, and aggression simmered constantly beneath the surface. From childhood, Ivan displayed deeply troubling behavior. His brother Boris would later claim that Ivan showed psychopathic tendencies from the age of 10, saying he always knew his brother would become a killer. Milat grew up to work as a road laborer, a job that kept him constantly moving along Australia's highways, intimately familiar with every back road, every isolated turnoff, every hidden trail between Sydney and Melbourne. It was the perfect cover for a predator. To neighbors, he seemed unremarkable, quiet, worked with his hands, But Ivan Milat had been on police radar for decades. Violent, aggressive towards authority, uncooperative, a frequent repeat offender with a long rap sheet of assaults and firearms offenses. He'd been in and out of police stations since childhood, learning early how to deflect, deny, and refuse cooperation. And he had an intimate knowledge of Belanglo State Forest, a place he'd hunted and camped since he was young. He knew the fire trails by heart, the hidden clearing, the spots where screams would dissolve into kilometers of empty bush. But knowing who might be responsible and proving it were two different things. Police needed evidence. They needed a witness. They needed someone who'd looked death in the face and lived to identify it. And then, in April 1984, they got exactly that. Paul Onions, living a continent away in the UK, saw news coverage of the Belanglo murders on TV. Something about the location, the forest, the highway, triggered a visceral memory. The face he'd never been able to forget. The man who pulled a gun on him 4 years earlier. Onions called the New South Wales police station, and when Superintendent Clive Small listened to his story, everything changed. It was January 25th, 1990. Paul Onions, 24, was hitchhiking south from Sydney along the Hume Highway, trying to save money during his Australian backpacking adventure. A silver pickup truck pulled up beside him near a corner store. The driver was muscular, good-looking, with a distinctive handlebar mustache. Need a ride? The man introduced himself as Bill. Onions, grateful to escape the heat, climbed in. At first, the conversation seemed normal, but then Bill's questions became strange, invasive, personal. Was anyone waiting for you in Canberra? Do you have special forces training? Does anyone know where you're headed? Onions felt unease creeping up his spine. The friendly driver was slowly but surely transforming into something unstable, something dangerous. Bill pulled over, claiming he wanted to grab a cassette tape from under the seat, but there were cassettes sitting right there on the armrest. Onions quietly stepped out, watching. Bill reached under the driver's seat and pulled out a length of rope. Panic flooded through Onions. He knew what was going to happen next. Bill pulled a revolver from beneath the seat and aimed it directly at Onions' chest. "You are being robbed." Onions fumbled with his seatbelt, clawing at the door handle. Bill produced rope to tie him up after pulling off the road, half a mile from Belanglo State Forest. But Onions didn't freeze. He threw himself from the vehicle and ran. Bill chased after him wildly, screaming that he was going to shoot. And he did. A flurry of bullets flew past Onions as he sprinted towards the highway. Cars slowed, saw him running, and drove past. Again and again, drivers all ignored his desperate pleas for help. Until finally, Onions threw himself in front of a car. The driver, Joanne Berry, had her family crammed in the back seat. Onions yanked the door open and climbed inside, terrifying and gasping. "Drive! He's got a gun!" Berry drove him straight to Bowral Police Station. There, Onions gave a detailed statement to a police officer. The man's appearance, the silver truck, the revolver, the location, everything. The report was properly filed, and then it sat in a cabinet for 4 years. At the time, no bodies had been found. No context existed for what Onions had survived. The report gathered dust while Onions, shaken and without his belongings or passport, caught his first flight back to the UK. But in 1994, when the Belanglo victims were discovered and Paul Onions saw the news, that report resurfaced. And suddenly, his terrifying encounter had a name: Ivan Milat. Small flew Onions back to Australia and prepared a photographic lineup. Without hesitation, Onions pointed directly at Ivan Milat's photo. Small had his smoking gun. Joanne Berry confirmed every detail of Onions' story. A girlfriend of a man who worked with someone named Ivan Milat called the police station, saying she believed Milat should be questioned. It was confirmed that Milat had not been at work the day of the Onions attack. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. The road worker who knew every highway, the violent offender with firearms experience, the man intimately familiar with Belanglo Forest, and the face that matched Paul Onions' description, the man who pulled the gun, tried to tie him up half a mile from where 7 bodies were buried. On May 22, 1994, Superintendent Small presented the evidence to a judge. It was enough for a warrant. Ivan Milat wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was the target. And at dawn, nearly 50 armed officers surrounded his home, ready for anything. But what they found outside would confirm their worst fears and reveal the true scope of the horror he'd been committing for years. They'd found their monster. Now they needed to prove it. In the early morning hours of May 22, 1994, nearly 50 police officers surrounded Ivan Milat's modest home in the Sydney suburb of Eagle Vale. Heavily armed officers from the Tactical Operations Unit took positions, donning bulletproof vests beneath their black uniforms. They were ready for anything. When they entered, Milat actually believed he was being pranked by a friend, but he quickly realized this was no joke. Officers arrested him immediately on robbery and weapon charges related on his assault on Paul Onions 4 years earlier. Then they began to search. What they discovered throughout Milat's home was nothing short of a treasure trove of evidence. Parts of a .22 caliber Anschutz model 1441/42 rifle were found, along with components of a .22 caliber Ruger 10/22 rifle, the exact type of weapon used in the murders. Casings of ammunition scattered throughout the property would later be tested, with ballistics matching the bullets pulled from Caroline Clark's skull. Nearly all the camping gear belonging to the victims was found in the raids. Sleeping bags that had traveled thousands of miles with their owners. Cameras that had captured final memories before the horror began. Backpacks meant to carry dreams of adventure, instead kept as trophies distributed throughout Milat's home like sick souvenirs. In a later search of the home of Ivan's mother, Margaret Milat, police discovered even more damning evidence locked away in a glass case. A carved machete, the type used to decapitate Anja Habshid. More victims' belongings were concealed there, hidden and preserved. The investigation widened. Police turned their attention to Ivan's brothers, Richard and Walter Milat, who are tried in a relation of weapons, drugs, and stolen items found on their properties. Suspicion hung particularly heavy over Richard, who police and the trial judge believe had been the main accomplice involved in the brutal serial murders. Richard appeared on national TV denying any involvement, but couldn't explain how camping equipment belonging to the victims ended up in his possession. Despite the mountain of evidence, Milat refused to talk. He was a veteran of investigation, police interrogations, having sat in interview rooms since childhood. He knew the game. He said nothing. On July 31, 1994, Ivan Milat was formally charged with 7 counts of murder. He hired John Marsden, his family's longtime attorney, to mount his defense. But even Marsden, convinced of his client's guilt, pressured to make him sign a guilty verdict. The evidence was too overwhelming, too undeniable. Milat's response? He fired Marsden and sought legal aid to pay for a new defense. He would plead not guilty on all counts. After multiple delays, the trial finally opened at the Supreme Court of New South Wales in Sydney on March 26, 1996. The prosecution, led by Mark Tedeschi, methodically laid bare the full horror. This wasn't random violence. This was premeditated torture, sadistic brutality, the calculated disposal of 7 young lives. Forensics experts testified about the methodical nature of the murders. Stab wounds inflicted with precision, designed to paralyze victims while keeping them alive. Restraints used to immobilize them during prolonged torture. Evidence of unspeakable cruelty. Ballistics matched weapons from Milat's home to bullets found lodged in victims' skulls. Paul Onions was the star witness. The one man who'd come face to face with death and survived. He recounted his story with unwavering detail and confidence, handling cross-examination with remarkable composure. His testimony was devastating, compelling, credible, and impossible to miss. The families followed. Parents spoke of their children: Caroline, Joanne, Deborah, James, Simone, Gabor, Anja, describing their lives, their dreams, the last time they saw them. The courtroom heard about the devastating loss that echoed through continents, the families that will never be whole again. The prosecution presented over 400 pieces of physical evidence, each item another nail in Milat's coffin: camping gear, weapons, personal belongings, ballistics, forensics, eyewitness testimony. The case was overwhelming, suffocating in its completeness. For his part, Ivan Milat took the stand to proclaim his innocence. He told the court he, quote, absolutely knew nothing that could shed any light upon it, unquote. But his story fell apart under cross-examination. His only explanation for the mountains of victims' belongings found in his home? He blamed his brothers. Despite the crushing weight of evidence, Milat remained confident he will be found innocent. He was a known narcissistic psychopath, manipulative, controlling, convinced of his own superiority. He sat through testimony with cold detachment, occasionally smirking, refusing to acknowledge the horror he'd inflicted. The trial lasted 15 weeks. On July 27, 1996, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. guilty on all 7 counts of murder. Milat was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each life he stolen, but an additional 6 years for the assault on Paul Onions. The judge made it unequivocally clear Ivan Milat would never walk free. He would die in prison. For the families, seeing justice served was the beginning of a long healing process. For Australia, it was the end of a nightmare that had gripped the nation. The backpacker killer was finally caged. But even behind bars, Ivan Milat's shadow would continue to stretch across Australia, and the forest that hid his secrets would never be the same. Justice was served, but some horrors never truly end. Even behind bars, Ivan Milat refused to surrender. In May 1997, security guards at Maitland Prison began hearing rumors of a possible jailbreak. The threat was serious enough to warrant immediate investigation. The mastermind? Ivan Milat. Milat had convinced his neighboring cellmate, George Savard, to help him stage an escape. But his plans were discovered before they could be executed. The 2 inmates were separated and moved to cells far apart. The following morning, George Savard was found hanged in his cell. Milat was promptly transferred to a Supermax security facility, where he spent his remaining years scribbling messages across the walls. Some proclaimed his innocence. Some quoted religious scripture. Others remained cryptic, meanings only known to Milat himself. He filed appeal after appeal, each one denied. His protests fell on deaf ears. On May 13, 2019, Ivan Milat was taken to Prince of Wales Hospital for lumps in his throat and stomach. The diagnosis was fatal: esophageal and stomach cancer. Knowing his time was short, police investigators made 8 attempts to secure a deathbed confession. They switched tactics, rotated investigators, even produced videos of recorded interviews with the victims' families, hoping something would break through Milat's defenses. Nothing worked. On October 27, 2019, Ivan Milat died in prison at the age of 74. He spent 23 years behind bars, maintaining his innocence until the very end. He never confessed to the murders for which he was convicted. He took his secrets to the grave. Even in death, his legacy remained divisive. Ivan's nephew, Alastair Shipley, wholeheartedly believed in his innocence, describing him as a good man with a kind heart, incapable of such terrible crimes. In 2005, Milat's former attorney John Madsen made a deathbed statement claiming that Ivan had confessed to him that he had been assisted in the killings. Marsden stated that Milat's sister, Shirley Soar, had helped with the murders of the 2 British backpackers. The claim sent shockwaves through the investigation, but was never substantiated with evidence. The question of an accomplice had never been resolved. Many believe it would have been nearly impossible for Milat to subdue, restrain, and murder multiple healthy young victims alone. Brother Richard Milat remains the primary suspect in many investigators' minds, but no tangible evidence had ever been found to charge him. But perhaps the most chilling chapter in the Milat legacy came in 2010, when Ivan's great-nephew, proved that evil can run in families. Matthew Milat, 17 years old at the time, lured his friend David Auchaloni into Belanglo State Forest on David's 17th birthday with promises of beer and marijuana. Instead, Matthew and his friend Cohen Klein tortured and killed David with a double-sided axe, while Klein recorded the murder on his phone. The location? Belanglo State Forest, the same hunting ground where his uncle's victims had been found. In 2012, Matthew Milat was sentenced to 43 years in prison, while Cohen Klein received 32 years. During his trial, Matthew referenced his great-uncle's crimes, seemingly to take pride in continuing the family's dark legacy. Belanglo State Forest remains synonymous with horror. Despite being an area of outstanding national beauty, the forest is now most associated with murder. 9 people had died there at the hands of 3 different killers, but it's Ivan Milat's crimes that haunt it most deeply. Memorials mark the spots where the victims were found. Simple plaques bearing names: Caroline, Joanne, Deborah, James, Simone, Gabor, Anja, surrounded by flowers left by strangers. Hikers pause when they encounter them, reading the inscriptions, feeling the weight of what happened beneath these trees. The backpack murders changed Australia forever. Up until the mid-1990s, hitchhiking was viewed as an adventurous and inexpensive means of travel. After Milat, that culture collapsed overnight. Parents warned their children. Travelers became wary. The image of a thumb raised along an Australian highway transformed from a symbol of adventure into one of danger. Today's travelers stick to buses, trains, organized tours. The freedom of the open road, the trust in a stranger's kindness, those relics of a more innocent time, died in Belanglo Forest. And the forest itself hasn't forgotten. Hikers report an unshakable feeling of being watched, of something wrong hanging in the air between the trees. Some places are stained by violence. Some places remember. The most haunting question remained unanswered. Were there others? 7 confirmed victims, but Milat had been driving those highways for decades. There is speculation that he may not have acted alone and may be responsible for more murders. Police continue investigating cold cases from the 70s and 80s, unsolved disappearances along the same routes Milat traveled. Missing backpackers, hitchhikers who vanished without a trace, cases that may never be solved. Milat's crimes became the inspiration for the Australian horror film Wolf Creek, ensuring his legacy would live on in popular culture. But for families of the victims, the horror was never fiction. Ivan Milat is gone, but his victims remain in the forest, in the memories of their families, in the permanent scar he left on Australia's sense of safety. The backpacker killer may be dead, but Belanglo Forest will never forget what it witnessed, and neither will we. Because some monsters die, but the nightmares they create and the evil they inspire live on forever.